The trade deadline has shaken things up nicely. From wide receiver trades to more major injuries, the fantasy landscape just keeps on changing. So, to keep you up to date, each week I'll be bringing you an article answering two simple questions. Who should I stream this week? And who should I stash for the future? On the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. As always, if you've got any questions, hit us up in the comments below, or you can find us over on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can find my rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. To keep things simple, we're going to define a streamer as any player you wouldn't usually start who's a viable option for this week. They may be on your bench or they may be on waivers, depending on your league. We'll define a stash as any player you can potentially find on waivers that you should stash for the future, either because they have a favorable matchup coming up or because they could become a future fantasy starter. Let's get into it. Start things off with the quarterback streamers. And if Joe Flacco can put up 40-plus points on the Chicago Bears, can you imagine what Jackson Dart can do? I imagine his lack of receiving talent will probably mean not 40 points, but his excellent rushing floor is what will likely be a shootout, makes Dart a great Week 10 start nonetheless. Meanwhile, I was tentatively optimistic about JJ McCarthy entering last week. After all, it was only his third NFL game, and he well and truly exceeded expectations. The Vikings slayed the Lions with the youngster putting up 20 fantasy points. He's available in most leagues, assuming you didn't take my advice and stash him last week, and gets a good quarterback matchup against the Ravens. He's a good low-cost streaming option. And if you need a stash, well, Aaron has been disappointing from a fantasy perspective this season, but he did have one bright spot in Week 7 against the Bengals. He faces them again in Week 11, making Rodgers a viable stash, especially if you're planning on relying on Daniel Jones, who has a Week 11 bye, for the rest of the season. Running back wise, and if DeAndre Swift remains out, this is far more obvious call than when I made it last week. But even if Swift plays, with the Bears facing the Giants, I'm starting Cole Manangai regardless. Meanwhile, the box score didn't show it, but Aaron Jones was the clear lead back in Week 9 before injury brought Jordan Mason back into the mix. In a possible shootout against the Ravens, who are particularly weak against the run, I'm expecting far more Jones than Mason and a particularly efficient RB performance in Week 10 from the veteran. Now let's go to the lower committee back on the other side of the Giants-Bears game as well. Chicago is weak against all fantasy positions, making Devin Singletary a viable deep streamer this week. He was surprisingly active last week, especially on early downs and especially on the goal line, and is a particularly solid option in non-PPR leagues. Now, if you're looking for a stash, there's quite a few around this week. Trey Benson shouldn't be available in your league, but according to NFL.com, he's available in nearly half. He's a great stash as he should be back from injury in a week or two and will slot into a top 20 fantasy running back role. Meanwhile, Kamani Vidal was awful against one of the league's weakest pass defenses last week, leading to a rise in Jarrett Patterson's touches. It's not impossible Patterson gets more involved if Vidal has another poor game, given Patterson literally doubled his yards per carry last week. Amari DeMarcado was the surprise starter against the Cowboys, ultimately getting more touches than Donovan Knight. That could remain the case moving forward, making the receiving back a viable stash in deeper leagues and a desperation streamer. Just remember, Trey Benson is going to be back soon. Meanwhile, running backs get injured more than any other player in fantasy, with the average top 36 running back missing 2 games per season in fantasy. For that reason, your best bet in fantasy is to roster running backs who are an injury away from an every down role. Every week, I'll be listing my favorite running back stashes, only including players you won't usually be starting most weeks. And you can see the list here. Blake Corum remains at the top with Brian Robinson. Good offenses. They will take the lead role and most of the touches if there's an injury. RJ Harvey is effective most weeks, and I feel like if he's by himself, he's going to get plenty of touches and be a good fantasy option. Isaiah Davis was high because of the risk that Breece Hall might be traded. That's not happening now, but I still feel like if there's a Hall injury, that Hall's going to be sat out for the season and that Davis has a better chance than most of being heavily involved. Emmanuel Wilson is a good chance of being effective if Josh Jacobs is out and he's already battling an injury. And Bashal Tootin, I feel like he's going to be the main guy if there's an injury to Travis Etienne. Most of the other guys will be more bit part players, but still be the clear lead back if there's an injury ahead of them. Tank Bigsby probably would have had more of a viable role if the Eagles weren't struggling to run the ball as much this week. Ollie Gordon, likewise, I don't think would be Devin Achane levels, but he's still going to be effective if there's an injury. Same thing with Amir Abdullah and Keaton Mitchell, who would be the main guy in a committee if there's an injury ahead of them. Wide receiver wise, and Troy Franklin has been Bo Nix's top receiving target in every game since week 5, making the breakout star in almost every week starter. But this week, there's even more reason to start the youngster as he faces a top 5 wide receiver matchup in the Raiders. Now, you stashed him last week. Now is the time to start Darius Slayton. I'm expecting a shootout against the Bears, as I think I've said 3 times already. And the Giants' deep threat is always a good chance of breaking a big play against weak secondaries. And Olamide Zaccheaus has been the Bears wide receiver 3 all season, but he's particularly benefiting from Luther Burden's injury of late with 15 targets in the last fortnight. Did I mention I think the Bears-Giants game might be high scoring? Well, Zaccheaus may benefit as well. As for stashes, the Jaguars slot receiver is where the value lies in a Liam Cohen offense, and that honor has fallen to Parker Washington since the Travis Hunter injury. I don't feel great about starting him against the Texans, firstly because of the matchup, but also because Jacoby Myers is arriving in town, and, well, he's possibly going to take the slot role, at least be involved, but Parker Washington is definitely worth a stash for the future. Though, if Brian Thomas Jr. misses week 10 with his minor ankle sprain, I would consider streaming Washington immediately as well. Tight end wise, the Colts are particularly susceptible to tight ends, and Kyle Pitts has 26 targets across his last 3 games. In fact, he played all but 3 snaps last week. He's almost a must start for me in week 10. And Kadon gets a solid week 10 matchup against the Jets and has quietly benefited from Tampa Bay's myriad of receiver injuries. He's consistently topped 40 yards over the last 5 weeks when he's played, getting double-digit PPR points in every game. And stash-wise, although Luke Musgrave was drafted before Tucker Kraft in the 2023 NFL Draft, he's nowhere near the receiver his injured teammate is. Think Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews. But he'll have every opportunity to develop into that role this season with Kraft out for the rest of the year. Musgrave has weekly top 10 upside, but a tremendously low floor. I need to see it before I trust him in my lineup. Now, kickers and DST, Cairo Santos, another player from the Giants and Bears game. Shocking. Santos, when combined with Jake Moody, who kicked for him during his injury, is a top 3 kicker on the season. This is an obvious choice for week 10. And here's a riskier upside pick. Will Reichard is a good kicker with a big leg who has a history of boom weeks against good teams. I'm taking a punt, bad pun intended, on him this week against the Ravens. Meanwhile, the Jets have blown up their roster in spectacular fashion at the trade deadline, while Justin Fields has been a goldmine for opposing DSTs. Starting the Browns DST feels like a pretty easy call this week. And Tyler Shuck was far from special in his starting debut, and he now loses his deep threat receiver in Rashid Shaheed and his starting left guard, Trevor Penning. I love the Panthers DST in this matchup. And as always, just a note, I won't be listing kicker or DST stashes. You should never put kickers or DSTs on your bench in redraft leagues. There's practically no exceptions, especially not this time of year. Just please don't do it. And that's all we've got for the Streamers and Stashes show in week 10. As always, you got questions, hit us up below or on my socials. I will be back in the coming days with more fantasy football fun. But if you've got any questions in the meantime, you can hit me up or you can just check out my rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. I'll see you again next time.